design and composition. Center of interest, emphasis. Mood in a picture is very important. And in this course, you learn that mood is not just established through the facial expressions of the figures that you put into your pictures, but the environment or setting in which they have been placed also contribute to establishing the mood and reinforcing or strengthening the mood set up with the figure. If you rely too heavily on just the facial expressions of the figure to get across the mood, then you are endangering yourself of creating a facial expression that looks too exaggerated. On the other hand, it is imperative that you be able to utilize intelligently all the various technical and pictorial means that you'll be learning in this course to create mood convincingly. And then the mood will be completely obvious in even abstract analysis of the picture. One of the most important elements in conveying mood in a picture is light and shadow. We know, for example, that a sunny day makes us feel happy, and a cloudy day has the opposite effect. Therefore, it's obvious that a depressing, sad picture should be painted in a low value key, and you'll be learning about value keys in this course. The emphasis would be on the use of dark tones in such a picture, while a more happy mood would require a higher value key with more lighter tones than dark ones. Moving on to composition, center of interest. This is of the greatest importance in composition. The center of interest is the most important part of a picture. It is where the eye of the viewer should come to rest. It should be led to the center of interest. A picture should have one main center of interest with secondary interests, one or two. Don't put too many in, because then things could get too confusing for the viewer. Keep it simple. These secondary points of interest should support the main point of interest. The main point of interest carries the theme of the picture, and therefore the secondary points of interest should support that main theme. In this example, one of these shapes will become the center of interest, and the other two will become secondary points of interest. As you can see, these are simple silhouette shapes that need to be arranged into a composition. Right now, they are all too similar in size. There is no one shape that dominates clearly over the others and establishes a clear center of interest. In the beginning, when you're planning your composition, it's best to think in terms of large, simple shapes and not about the details. The details come later. Keep it simple in the beginning. My problem here is to arrange these shapes so that there is a clear center of interest with secondary points of interest that will make an interesting composition. Right now, that doesn't exist in this example. If I start to move some of these shapes, like the spaceship, for example, like that, and then this creature over to the right and make him a little bit smaller, I have a different arrangement, but the spaceship seems too important. There still isn't a clear center of interest, and there isn't any really interesting arrangement yet. The strongest value contrast should occur at or near the center of interest. Because this figure has the darkest value, it creates the strongest value contrast, and therefore already helps to establish the figure as the center of interest. But it's still not clear enough and interesting enough because of the competition of the spaceship with this figure in terms of its size. The spaceship needs to be changed in size, and the figure made larger. You need to avoid competition between the various forms and shapes and values and colors within your composition. That's why you need to establish a hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy is the center of interest, because that's where the strongest contrasts are going to occur that will attract the eye of the viewer. And then there are these other lesser contrasting shapes and forms and colors that attract less attention. So this hierarchy is established within the composition. And it is through emphasizing the center of interest that the eye of the viewer will be attracted to it. Since this arrangement isn't working, I'm going to try a different one. First of all, what I'm going to do is change the size of the picture area, or the format shape, to one that is more vertical, something like that. And then I think I'm going to move this figure over as well as the spaceship. Something like that. And then I'm going to crop the right side, or cut off those shapes at the right border, like that. Maybe move the spaceship over a little bit more. And then I'm going to enlarge this dark figure so that it clearly becomes dominant in size over the other two shapes. This figure now clearly is the center of interest, established through its dominant size and strong value contrast. However, there is a problem with these shapes here. Now they look crowded. It looks like this large shape is pushing these shapes over and crowding that border. So this arrangement isn't very good either. Also, these shapes now no longer read very clearly. You can't easily tell what they're supposed to be. I'm going to try a different arrangement. I'll widen the picture area a little, and then move this spacecraft and reduce its size somewhat. And now I'll reduce the size of this creature and place the creature against the spacecraft like that. Bring down the spacecraft a little bit, and the creature up a little. This arrangement works better than the previous one. There isn't that kind of crowding on the right side of the picture area like there was. However, there is this negative vertical space here that is disturbing. Don't create this kind of narrow space between a shape and the border of the picture area. Parallels are created here, and these kind of parallels and this kind of small negative space needs to be avoided. It's disturbing. I made some adjustments to this arrangement by lengthening the bottom of the picture area and eliminating that negative space that was over here. And now the shapes over here read much more clearly. You can tell that there's a spaceship back here and that there is this creature, this figure over here. There is a hierarchy established by the stronger value contrast and size of the center of interest, which is here, compared to these secondary points of interest that are smaller in size and where the value contrasts are less. The secondary points of interest, such as this spaceship, are made less important also
by hiding it somewhat, by way of overlapping the spaceship with the arm and gun of the man, and by the foreground figure here, by overlapping that figure with the spaceship, more of that spaceship has been hidden and therefore made less important. This small figure stands in front of the spaceship and therefore becomes more important. And you can clearly see that the value contrasts are much less here and here on these secondary points of interest than they are here. The white figure contrasts less with the gray background against which it is seen than the black figure does with the light value of the background against which it is seen. So thereby, because of the lesser value contrasts, this area becomes less important. I might try something in the way of making the picture area a little wider, allowing more space on the right side. As you can see, I've made some changes here. Now this creature has become more important because I've enlarged the size of the creature. In the previous version, which you see here, you can see that the creature is much smaller and not as important as it is now in this version. In this version, the strongest value contrast doesn't occur here. It occurs right here. Because you see, the black is seen against the white. And here, the black is seen against a gray background. So there is a greater amount of value contrast right here. And the gun points directly to this creature. So one could say that the creature has now become the center of interest because everything is pointing to the creature. The arm, the gun, and the strong value contrast are all pointing to the creature. And I can make this center of interest stronger by darkening the background, for example. In this version, the spaceship is larger and therefore more important than it is in this version, in which I made the spaceship the smallest shape and placed it farther up in the picture area in order to create a feeling of depth, of distance, that the spacecraft is farther away and less important. Here, the foreground figure and the creature are more important than the spaceship is. There's a hierarchy from this figure to this to what's least important, which is the spaceship. In this version, it is clear that this figure is the center of interest. However, in this example here, it is more likely that this creature is the center of interest. And therefore, I need to strengthen this center of interest more. And I'll do that by starting off with a darker background. As you can see, now this figure becomes less important because the value contrast is no longer as strong as it was before because I darkened the background. But this figure here, this creature, has now gained in emphasis because of a stronger value contrast that now exists here because of that darker background. However, the spaceship is almost completely lost because the value is too similar to that of the background. So the value needs to be made darker. I'd like to point something out to you, and that is when something is white or near white, where there is a stronger value contrast, such as here, where you can more clearly see the white when it doesn't blend in with a very light background, then the eye will be attracted to that white. White is a strong visual attractor and can be used on the center of interest or near it to attract the viewer's eye to the center of interest. As you can see, I made the spacecraft lighter in value rather than darker. This helps to push the spacecraft back further when you have darks in the foreground and lighter values in the distance, a greater feeling of depth or distance is achieved. And when you have four values like this with which you are planning your composition, where you have a dark, a middle value, and a light, and then a light middle value, make sure that the middle value doesn't fall at the middle on the value scale. And this is something that I talked about in an earlier video. That middle value should be closer to the darker value that you see here. And that's why this gray is of the value that it is, because it's closer to this dark than it is to this light value or this light value here. However, in this case, with the value of the spacecraft, that middle value is closer to the light value. This is a light middle value. Try to remember this rule for creating value patterns. I talked about this in Volume 7. So if you're not really familiar with value patterns and what I'm talking about here, then check out Volume 7 in the Art Track video series. If you don't have it, try to get a hold of that video, because it's very important. You cannot create interesting paintings without a really great value pattern. In this example, it's the exact opposite. Here, the background is light in value and closer to the light value of the figure. And the spaceship is a darker value, closer to the dark value of this foreground figure. Although in this case, I might make the spaceship value a little darker, it might be too much in the center of the value scale. If you're not familiar with the value scale, you'll learn about that in Volume 7. So check back to Volume 7. Now, I also want to point out that, you see, the value contrast here is less than it is up here. And that's because the legs are not as important as the upper part of his body is. So these are the things you have to think about. Where do you want more attention to be directed? And where you want less attention directed, create less value contrast. And where you want more attention directed, create more value contrast. Strong value contrasts are one of the chief means through which you can draw attention to the center of interest, to the most important part of your painting, where you want the viewer to look. There's something I'd like to point out to you, and that is, be aware of the negative spaces, the spaces that make negative shapes. And this negative shape and this one here are too similar in size. Make sure that your negative shapes are different in size, with one dominating, that is, one negative space should be larger than all the others. They shouldn't be similar in size, like they are here. So if I wanted to develop this composition further, I would make sure that one of the spaces is much larger than the others, so that I have a dominant negative shape. And then I can have the smaller shapes and a medium-sized shape. But don't make them all similar in size. The variety of the different sizes will help to create a lot of interest in your painting. And their shapes should also be different. Don't make them the same or too similar. Have a variety of different shapes, but they should have a similar character. And I talked about shapes in earlier videos, so hopefully you were able to see those videos. If not, then you need to get a hold of them. And I talked a lot about shapes in Volume 7. Here I want to show you that you do not need a large shape or form, such as this, in order for it to be the center of interest. You can have a smaller shape like this, and it can become the center of interest. Here, it becomes the center of interest because of the strong value contrast. and because the eye is drawn to white. This strongest value contrast right here, the black against the white, is what helps to draw the eye here to the center of interest, which is now this creature. Before, when there was less contrast, the figure was more important. If I wanted to, I could add maybe a pattern or something like that, for example, which would further help to draw the attention here and establish this figure as the center of interest, where there is no question that this is the center of interest. And if I add a color, I add another element of design that further helps to draw attention here. Contrast, or the lack of it, determines what the eye will be attracted to. The stronger the contrast, the more the eye will be attracted there than to other parts of the composition where there are less contrasts, either value or color or texture, for example. So adding a pattern like this creates a somewhat busyness that attracts the eye. And of course, since this is the only color within this arrangement, the eye will be attracted there because of that contrast of color against no color. These are the kind of compositional devices that you need to employ to direct the attention to the center of interest, to establish one part of your composition as being the most important part, as being the center of interest. However, be careful not to overdo all of these contrasts that you add, where you add everything that you can think of. Then that center of interest will be too strong. It will rivet the eye of the viewer to such a degree that the eye is then not encouraged to also wander to other parts of the composition, explore the picture, see other parts, and then return to the center of interest. So you have to be careful not to overdo it. The center of interest doesn't have to be blatantly emphasized in order to be effective and draw the eye of the viewer there. It can be done in more subtle ways. I've made some additions here to the center of interest, as you can see, and this serves as an extreme example just to point out to you and show you what needs to be established at the center of interest. That's where the greatest amount of value contrast occurs. That's where the greatest amount of detail occurs and the greatest amount of color contrast. It needs to be the most interesting part of the entire picture. However, some of these things that I'm pointing out to you do not necessarily need to be placed right on the center of interest, but you could place them near the center of interest. So you place the strongest value contrast somewhere close by, and that would attract the attention of the viewer to the center of interest because the center of interest is close to where the strongest contrasts are occurring. Here's a really rough sketch that I did just to show you how by placing a strong contrast, such as a value contrast, near the center of interest, you can direct the eye of the viewer to the center of interest, which is this figure, without actually placing the strongest value contrast on the center of interest. This dark pillow here is close enough to the center of interest to attract the eye of the viewer to the center of interest. The eye doesn't stay on the pillow. It seeks out the figure, which is more interesting than a pillow is. But the pillow helps to direct the attention to the figure by placing the dark pillow near it. This is a digital painting that I did in Photoshop. and it was done to illustrate a science fiction story that appeared in the American science fiction magazine called Analog. The illustration appeared in grayscale, however, because within the pages of Analog, they don't publish color illustrations. But I did the painting in color, but they printed it as a grayscale. I want to show you this painting because here the center of interest has been emphasized by placing a contrasting color on it, by giving it a violet color, which is the complementary color, or rather near complementary color, to yellow-orange. And because of this strong contrast of color, the eye of the viewer is drawn to the figure, and thereby the figure is established as the center of interest. By placing a smaller contrasting color, such as this, within a sea of other color, where the color contrasts are not as strong, the eye will be directed to that part of the composition where the strongest color contrast occurs, and that will establish the center of interest. Here you can see that the color contrasts are more analogous. Orange and yellow-orange do not attract as much attention as the stronger color contrasts here, violet and yellow-orange. So this is a way of establishing your center of interest and drawing attention to it. I'm going to darken the value of the background in order to increase the value contrast of this figure with its background, thereby making it more prominent and this foreground figure less prominent, because the value contrast will not be as strong as it is now between the foreground figure and the background. And this is how you can control the amount of attention that something will receive within your composition, by controlling the amount of value contrast that you give your forms. Now, this white figure appears more prominent because of the greater value contrast that it now has, and therefore this center of interest has been strengthened. If I had kept the value in the background lighter, like it was before, then this foreground dark figure would be a bit too prominent. Now, as I have already mentioned, the center of interest doesn't have to be large like this large figure in the foreground. It could be small like this small figure here and still be the center of interest. And the larger shape is not the center of interest. It becomes less important. Like in this example here, it becomes less important because the value contrasts between the foreground and the background are not as great as the value contrasts found here between the figure and its background and between the gun and the white figure here and here. This is where the strongest value contrasts occur. Take a look over here at this example. And I'm going to show you how, by changing the value contrasts, you can change which shape will be the center of interest. If I darken the background here, and then darken the spacecraft, now that I've made this spaceship in the background darker, there is a stronger value contrast now on this small white figure. And therefore, it becomes the center of interest because it commands most of the attention, even though it's small in size like this. So you see, you don't have to make your shapes large in size to have a center of interest. The center of interest can be small and still attract attention. It all depends on how much contrast you place at the center of interest or near it. This is now the area where the strongest value contrast occurs, and therefore this is where the attention of the viewer will be directed to. I made a few changes, as you can see. In this example, I moved these two shapes. The arrangement needed to be made a little more compact. Don't spread your shapes out too much when you're overlapping them like this. And also, don't bring them too close together so that the entire unit looks too tight. In this example here, there is a greater contrast of sizes of shapes between this foreground shape and this one here, making this arrangement much more dramatic than this one. I also darkened this spacecraft in the background a little so that the top portion of this figure shows up better, reads better, because of a somewhat stronger value contrast. I use these simple, rough examples to show you how to create a center of interest and how to direct the viewer's attention to it. Using simple silhouette shapes like these with different values is a good way to plan your value patterns with. Create simple arrangements like these with silhouette shapes such as you see here without any details in them. In the beginning stages, don't think about details. Think only about large, simple shapes and how to arrange them, like in my rough examples here.
Here's a quick rough sketch that I did to show you what not to do. Too many artists, especially students, will complete each part of a picture too much. Every part will have too much detail, be too precise, too exact, too complete, or too finished looking. And that is a mistake. The various parts of a picture shouldn't have the same degree of finish. In this example, you can see that every part has a lot of detail. It has the same degree of finish. Nothing is left to the imagination. The viewer looking at this will not be able to contribute anything from his or her own imagination because everything is stated here explicitly. Nothing is suggested. All of the detail can be seen. And many artists will get so caught up in trying to render an object perfectly and apply a lot of detail to it that every part of the picture will then have the same degree of finish and the same importance. And this is a mistake because in a picture there needs to be a hierarchy. Some things need to be more important than others. And the most important part of a picture should be the center of interest. And in this rough sketch, the center of interest is this figure here. But a lot of attention is taken away from that center of interest because of all of the detail that you see in the other parts of the picture, and the fact that all of the other parts have the same degree of finish to them. Certain areas within a picture that are of primary interest, such as the center of interest, like you see here, should be finished off with considerably more detail, while the handling of the rest of the painting should be more suggestive, rather than appearing more as an explicit statement. Painting a picture in this manner stems from the law of nature, which states that human vision teaches us that we can concentrate or focus our eyes on only one thing at a time. So this same idea needs to be applied to a picture. While focusing on one object at a time, everything else outside of that object that you're focusing on will not have the clarity that the object that you're focusing on has. You won't be able to notice as much detail on those surrounding objects as you do on the object that you're focusing on. Everything else surrounding that object that you're focusing on becomes somewhat of a blur compared to the object that is being focused on. Artists who understand this and apply it to their paintings save themselves a lot of work because they don't have to finish off every part of the picture so that it has the same degree of finish that the center of interest has. The other parts are more suggested, and therefore there's less work involved. But it's not about more or less work. It's about applying this law of nature that I just stated. That is going to make your paintings much more effective than if you finish off every part of the picture so that every part looks like every other part, has the same degree of finish and detail. The surroundings can be handled in a more loose manner, while the center of interest can have a bit more of a tighter look to it. But don't make it look like two different paintings. One painting that is done very loosely, and then another that is done in a very tight way. You need to gradually increase the amount of tightness as you get closer to the center of interest. So more and more detail and more of a finished look should appear as you get closer to the center of interest with the greatest amount of finish and detail on the center of interest. This way, you'll avoid having a picture that looks like the center of interest doesn't belong with the rest of the painting. For example, let me just quickly indicate something here that represents a more loose appearance. And I'm doing this very quick, as you can see. The center of interest now pops out, appears much more tight looking than the surroundings, but it also looks like it doesn't really belong with the rest of the painting. It looks like it would fit into another painting better that has a more tight look. But if you gradually increase the amount of tightness and keep the surroundings like this looser, and then gradually increase the amount of tightness and detail, something like this, but it's very rough as you can see, that works better. Now it doesn't pop out like it did before. Here's the other version, and here's this version in which a more gradual increase of tightness and detail occurs as you approach the center of interest. There's a gradation that is taking place from less detailed, more loose, to gradually getting tighter and more detailed. And gradation is a principle of design. So when you're applying this, you're applying a principle of design. And if you apply principles of design to your work, you can't go wrong. The surroundings become more generalized. So that means that all of the detail that you see here, that needs to be minimized or eliminated. So for example, I could just go over this detail like this, eliminating most of it, leaving a little bit. I don't have to eliminate all of the detail. And then over here as well, come in here and darken this whole thing, thereby subduing the detail. Also on this helmet over here, this part, all this detail here can be minimized or eliminated. Detail on the spacecraft here also needs to be minimized, which means less detail. See how I'm eliminating that detail and just keeping a little bit of it. Now on the figure here, on the center of interest, the lower part right there is attracting too much attention. So all I need to do is darken this part like this, thereby making that detail much less apparent. I can still keep some of it. And also on his belt, that belt is attracting too much attention, so that detail needs to be minimized. More detail can be kept closer to his head. See all this detail here? That can be kept because it helps to draw attention to the head. Now over here, some of this detail needs to be eliminated or just less detail added on these weapons that they're holding. And the surroundings are darkened. Already you can see that more attention is now directed to the center of interest, because all of this detail that was distracting attention away from the center of interest has now either been eliminated or just made less of. I'm going to bring back the previous version in which all of the detail is there, and you can compare the two versions. You see how distracting all that detail is from the center of interest? But when I minimize or eliminate that detail, like in this version, you can see that this version appears much more effective, more interesting. And of course, the center of interest is emphasized more. So the eye of the viewer is led to the center of interest. But in this version, all that detail distracts from the center of interest. And this version is not very appealing, not very satisfying, but this version is. And I think I'll eliminate this light right there, which is distracting, drawing attention down to it. I want the attention focused up here. That's why the light sky has been added. It draws the attention upward to where the head of the man is, and then making his hair dark like that and placing it against that light sky creates a strong value contrast that draws the eye here to his head. It's at the center of interest where the strongest value contrast should be placed. Nowhere else should there be such a strong value contrast. That's why you place the darkest dark against the lightest light at the center of interest, which will then draw attention to it. Now I could make his hair even darker. Like that. The values in the foreground here can be made lighter, a bit lighter, and that helps to have this value appear as the darkest value, and it helps to draw attention to the head. See, I'm making all the other values a bit lighter in value. You can see how that dark of his hair now stands out against that light value background. There are some other parts that need to be made a little bit lighter, like right there, that dark can be made a bit lighter. Now this is, after all, just a rough sketch, so there's some things that I might not see, and maybe later on, if I study the painting more carefully, there are things that I might change that I don't notice now. In addition to what I've shown you that draws attention to the center of interest, concentrating relatively small dynamic areas of light and color on the center of interest will further draw the eye to it. So, for example, if I added some light falling on parts of his head and his helmet that he is holding here and on his hair like this, just these little spots of light will draw attention to the center of interest and specifically to the upper part of his body, to where the head is. The light that's falling on him is a warm yellowish light, which contrasts nicely with the more bluish dominant color throughout this rough sketch. So there is a warm, cool color temperature contrast at the center of interest that further helps to draw attention to the center of interest. This is where most of the activity occurs, right here. This is where most of the different kinds of shapes and colors and values occur. This is the active area. The surroundings, which are treated in a more generalized, suggestive way, is a place that is more restful compared to the center of interest. And after the eye looks at the center of interest, the eye roams around the picture to the more generalized, restful parts, and then returns back to the center of interest. So there's this balance between an active area and more restful areas. Always create this kind of balance. Don't have everything active. The most active part should be at the center of interest and not over here somewhere that would then draw attention away from the center of interest. Remember to save all of your detail and interest for what you deem the most important part of your picture. When a picture is well done in this manner, it never becomes tiresome. The generalized parts, such as you see here, become areas of rest. The imagination of the observer, excited by the concentrated areas of interest here, will unconsciously supply details throughout these areas of rest. If you leave something to the imagination of the viewer, allowing him or her to complete the picture in his own way, you will create a final unity in your picture, and this unity can be attained in no other way. A picture which is complete and finished in every detail within itself is not complete. It leaves nothing for the person to do who views the thing. In a sense, it cheats him out of his right to participate in the painting, and therefore he feels that it is unsatisfactory. It is partly for this reason that I have just stated, that the viewer will tire of pictures that are too complete looking, and the viewer will tire of the picture very quickly. What I've been showing you here can be summed up as the principle of emphasis. I should also add that by making the viewer look where we want him to look, it can also be used to tell a story with more power. I made a change here, and I'll point that out to you. You might have already seen it. I added some more light falling on this part of the helmet and down here on his costume. So more light falling on the figure emphasizes the center of interest even more. And it also helps to create a better balance between a light value up here that needs to be repeated somewhere else, which is now repeated down here. But in spite of the light value here and here, the eye is still drawn up to the head. Also, this light value on the foreground figure helps to further balance the light that you see up here. You see, you shouldn't have just one light spot within the picture like this, for example. If I darken all of these light spots here, darken all of this, and now what you see is just this light spot up here. And it just rivets the eye up there. And the eye is not encouraged to move around the picture and look elsewhere. And the balance is off, because if I have a light up here, I need to have a light somewhere else within the picture, somewhere around here. So therefore, by adding those other lights like this, I am able to achieve a better balance and encourage the eye to look at other parts of the picture, here and then up there and around like that. So these light spots added help to move the eye from this part to this part to this part and up and around like that. Now there's some adjustments I need to make, like here, for example, those spots are too light, so I need to make them a bit darker. They're a little too distracting. They detract attention from the center of interest. You see, by making them darker, they become less distracting. And now the eye can focus more on the center of interest. See what happens when I return those light spots. See how distracting they are from the center of interest? But by making them darker like that, they're no longer distracting. You see, even the smallest spots within a picture can be distracting. So you really need to pay attention to every part of a picture and make sure everything is correct, everything is the way it should be, and doesn't harm the picture in any way, but rather contributes to the success of the picture. I'm going to show you a painting by the great artist Edgar Degas. And in this painting, he does exactly what I've been showing you. Most of the detail is focused here, where the center of interest is. See all the little detail on the face here and here. The faces are the most important part of the picture. Everything else surrounding these figures here, all of this, is handled in a more suggestive, loose, indefinite manner. Because all of this isn't really very important. What's really important are these two figures, and specifically the faces. Just imagine if Degas had treated the rest of the painting surrounding the figures in the same detailed way that the faces are handled. The eye would be distracted from the center of interest if he did that. And he knew that would occur if he added a lot of detail here all over the place. So therefore, he focused all of the really important detail here at the heads. Where the center of interest is, create sharp focus. Then, as you move away from the center of interest, more of a soft focus occurs, as I've been pointing out to you. Things appear more vague looking, more suggestive, less detailed. And if you do that, your paintings will become much more successful. People will not tire of them. They will want to look at them again and again. Emphasis. In order for you to direct the viewer's attention to the center of interest, you must learn the value of emphasis. This is the stressing of one important item in the design in order to increase attention value and to avoid monotony. This rough color sketch shows an example of emphasis. The eye is drawn to this woman here because of the strong value contrast that occurs here. The light value seen against the black of her hair. This is emphasis through value contrast. There's also emphasis through color contrast. By placing contrasting colors together, such as red and green or blue and orange, attention can be directed to a particular spot within the composition. For example, I could make this part right there blue. And now the blue, which is a cool color, contrasts sharply with the warmer color seen on the woman's face, which is more of a yellow-orange and orange. So this is an example of emphasis through color contrast or hue contrast. Hue referring to what the color actually is and its name, which is a blue hue. So here I now have both value contrast as well as color contrast that draws the eye of the viewer to the head of the woman. In order for emphasis to occur, the surroundings, this and this, needs to have less value contrast and color contrast. And you can see the values here are closely related, are more similar than the values here at the center of interest. So if I made the values contrast more over here by making this part of the picture lighter like that, now too much attention is directed here and away from the center of interest. But by returning the value to the way it was, now the attention is not drawn to this part, but rather to where it should be drawn, right there. So you see, emphasis is created by making the surroundings have less value contrast and color contrast, while the center of interest, the most important part of your picture, has greater value and color contrast. Emphasis is also achieved by making the surroundings less detailed, and then the center of interest has greater detail. So let's say I add even more detail than what is there now by adding a necklace like this. And these little shapes add additional detail that further helps to draw the attention to the woman. The surroundings have no detail. Also, emphasis is directed toward the center of interest by making the color there a bit more saturated than in the surroundings. And you can see that right here where the blue color is, that blue is more saturated than the colors that you find in other parts of the picture. Here the color is more desaturated, more grayed than this blue, as well as over here and here. So that also helps to draw the attention to the head of the woman by making the color there a bit more saturated, while the other colors are more grayed. I should mention, however, that it's not just this blue color that appears more saturated, but also the color on her face is more saturated than the surrounding colors, which further helps to create this kind of bullseye here, like that draws the eye of the viewer to the head of the woman, which is the center of interest. Let's say you have additional units within the composition besides this woman. And I'll add another unit or shape right there, that man standing in front of the door. When you have additional units or shapes, it is usually advisable to give varying degrees of emphasis to these other shapes. If you don't give varying degrees of emphasis to the different shapes and you have them all of equal contrast, then the eye of the viewer is going to be torn between the different shapes of equal contrast. Therefore, this conflict needs to be resolved, and it is resolved through dominance. Right now, this woman is dominant because of the strong value and color contrast found here. Strong value and color contrast creates dominance. This man is hardly seen, and I can give him a bit more emphasis, but never as much as the woman, because if I did that, then there would be conflict between the man and the woman. So you can see me adding a little bit of a lighter value to his clothing He's receiving some of the light, but not as much light as the woman, because she is closer to the light source. And then I'll add some color to his face as well. Now, the man is seen a bit more than he was before. He stands out a bit more, but he doesn't stand out as much as the woman. Less emphasis is given to the man, more to the woman. So here you see an example of varying degrees of emphasis applied to different shapes. Watch what happens when I add just as much value contrast and color contrast to the man that the woman has. You can see that the attention now is torn between these two because there's no dominance. The eye jumps from one to the other and doesn't really know where to rest, where to focus on, where to stay. There's too much equal attention given to both of these shapes. And let me just add a bit more value contrast here. Add an even lighter value like this. See how the attention now is torn between these two shapes? But as soon as I remove that strong contrast, now the attention is directed toward the woman, more so than toward the man. I could even increase the man's contrast a little bit more by making his face a bit lighter in value in certain spots where the light is hitting, and on his costume, but not that much. As soon as I add a little too much contrast, then too much attention is directed to the man. I think this is okay.